Let's take a look at Elizabeth Palmer Peabody's record of a school. By the way, a little trivia note here. Elizabeth Palmer Peabody is the sister of Sophia Peabody, and Sophia Peabody was the wife of Nathaniel Hawthorne. This is a close-knit bunch. Elizabeth Palmer Peabody knew Nathaniel Hawthorne. He was a terribly sort of paralyzingly shy young man, and he practically had to force him to meet her sister Sophia, whom she thought would be a very good match, and they ended up being a wonderful match for each other. Anyway, on to our main subject here. One of the things that you find in reading Peabody's record of a school is that she continuously harps on this theme throughout the work that all education hinges on contemplation of the Spirit. And this is a very transcendental thing, obviously, that learning comes from within. Learning, education, as she says, is self-realization. That is really very important. It's not an external search for truth or learning. It's an internally focused pedagogy. That is to say, the educational systems of the day encourage students to go out and read this or go out and look at that or go out and observe this and then report on it and just report information, facts, blah, blah, blah. What Peabody and Alcott are trying to do is to make the case for an intuitive source of education, that what we need to know is already within us. We're born with it, and it's an unfolding, as she says. At one point she says, in general terms, contemplation of the Spirit is the first principle of human culture, the foundation of self-education. The point here is, as she says, early education is the leading of the young mind to self-education. A lot of modern education theory, beginning with Dewey and the progressives and these kind of guys, and even Montessori theorists and such, and Piaget and all of these guys, are very in tune with this notion of what we want to do is to create people, young people, who are self-educators eventually. That's what we're working towards. This was not something that was predominant during Alcott's time. It was quite the contrary. You had to beat education into people. People were, by their very nature, as the Puritans would say, are by their very nature stubborn and ignorant, and you have to pound education into them. Alcott is one of the very first to come along with what seems to us to be a very widely accepted notion, that is that young people like to learn. They want to learn. They're born ready to learn. They're curious. They're eager to learn. This is quite radical and revolutionary for the time. Seems normal to us. As a result, he didn't believe in corporal punishment. Doesn't mean he didn't believe in punishing bad behavior, but he didn't believe in corporal punishment. These are both very radical things. Spirit, as it unveils itself within themselves, is what they're after. That's the source, the fountain of all knowledge. That's the thing, the seed that's going to get them to want to be educated. It's the thing that's going to get them jump-started to educate themselves, and that will provide a lifetime of momentum for them. Love of learning is what we would say. We need to cultivate a love of learning. That's straight from Alcott, and prior to Alcott, I didn't hear anybody ever talking about that sort of thing in education theory. Now, Peabody goes into a very substantial discussion of the rigorous curriculum that they had. I've given you a little bit in this slide, a little bit of a scorecard of what the average day and week, the days and weeks would cover in terms of their subject matter and things, everything from spelling and reading and these sorts of things. And so she goes into considerable detail about that. One of the most curious things, no one prior to this period that I know of paid much attention to the way a classroom looked, and Alcott really is the first. He wants the whole classroom to be designed with learning in mind. It seems kind of obvious to us, but it certainly wasn't obvious then, that the environment the students are in for 6, 7, 8 hours a day makes a difference. most people had never occurred to them prior to Alcott. I think Alcott's the first one that I know of in modern times to emphasize that that was really important. And so he would put busts of famous people around the room. He would frequently refer to them in his conversations and lectures and activities. He would put materials from the natural world, butterflies and stuffed animals and these kinds of things around the room, maps and quotations, famous sayings, inspirational things, things that today you walk in a modern elementary school classroom, you'll see all over the place. Prior to Alcott, nothing like that. I mean, the room was a pretty stark dungeon, frankly. Poor kids. But Alcott's the first one that I know of that comes along with this notion that we need to decorate the room so that everything in the room, and I mean everything, has some instructional purpose, either moral instruction or academic instruction or spiritual instruction. Every item, every physical thing in the room, every detail in the room is pointed towards the edification, the uplifting, the education of the child. One of the things that you note is that in Peabody's discussion, she talks a little bit about behavior problems. She says, when they sat in the semicircle around him, they were not only requested to be silent, but to appear attentive to him. And any infringement of the spirit of this rule would arrest his reading, and he would wait, however long it might be, until attention was restored. For some time, the acquirement of this habit of stillness and attention was the prominent object, for it was found that many of the children had very little self-control, very weak attention, very self-indulgent habits. But here's Alcott, and figures, you know what, I will be silent until I get order. And when you all have order, we will continue. Now, the inclination is to say, you know what, threaten, pound, yell, do whatever's necessary to get the kids to behave. But Alcott's approach was, I will sit here until you know what freezes over and you kids get incredibly bored. Not only that, but he's using a little bit of peer pressure on them. So it seems to some that this is awfully soft sort of discipline, but when you think about it, it's actually not too bad. You just have to be incredibly patient, more patient than I would be, I can tell you that, with a room full of 6-year-olds. Also, the children agreed that punishment was necessary. He actually opens this up and says, do you think that we should punish children who are naughty? After a consideration of its nature and issues, they all very cheerfully agreed that it was necessary, and that they preferred Mr. Alcott should punish them rather than leave them in their faults, and that it was his duty to do so. Various punishments were mentioned, and hurting the body was decided upon as necessary and desirable in some instances. It was universally admitted that it was desirable whenever words were found insufficient to command the memory of conscience. So there was some corporal punishment, but it was largely the case that he almost never doled it out. It didn't become necessary to do. He was really interested, the main goal here is leading them to come to their own conclusions on morality. That is really the most important thing that he's trying to get them to do. He's trying to teach them that they can't know God until they know themselves. That's important. So the source of morality is inward, but it's the godliness that you're born with that's most important. The human soul is like a plant's organization. We feed on the physical earth. We need the material, but each sort of discriminates on what it can take in. That's the metaphor that she uses towards the end of this. So quite an interesting piece, quite an interesting detail. If you're in the field of education, this is a work that you really shouldn't ignore. You really should look at it because it's quite it's a very overlooked piece, but quite important in terms of the history of experimental education in America.